Every major economic collapse in modern history had one thing in common. The people who built generational wealth during it didn't react to the crash. They prepared for it. For decades, the mainstream financial narrative has told you the same story. Crashes are unpredictable. Diversification is your only shield, and if you try to time the market, you'll lose. That story is true for one group of people. It was never meant to protect the other. The other group, the one whose quarterly SEC filings and private wealth reports paint an entirely different picture, has been running a playbook for over a century. A playbook that begins not when the market falls, but roughly 18 to 24 months before it does. Here are the 5 assets that appear on that list. One of them is technically available to anyone. Most people have never heard of it. And the 5th one is the mechanism through which wealth is legally transferred from the middle class to the ultra-wealthy during every single major downturn in recorded history. Asset 1. Let's start with the one that sounds the most boring. Because boring, in the language of institutional wealth, means lethal. Before the dot-com collapse in 2000, before the 2008 financial crisis, and before the 2020 COVID shock, one pattern appeared consistently in the SEC 13F filings of the wealthiest institutional investors in America. They were not buying gold, they were not moving into real estate, they were not rotating into commodities, they were buying short-duration government paper, treasury bills, 90-day sovereign instruments yielding barely more than a savings account. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway reached over $130 billion in T-bills and cash equivalents by mid-2023, before the regional banking crisis, before the commercial real estate reckoning. The financial press called it missed opportunity. They said he was too conservative. They said the old man had lost his edge. What he was doing was loading the gun. This is the first truth that separates ultra-high net worth behavior from conventional financial wisdom. The wealthy don't treat cash as something that costs them yield. They treat it as the only asset that converts into every other asset at the exact moment when those assets are bleeding out. Look at the historical mechanics. During the 2008 to 2009 crash, S&P 500 companies lost roughly 57% of their value at the trough. If you held $10 million in T-bills earning 2%, you earned $200,000 while everyone else lost half of everything. But more importantly, you had $10 million in a market where extraordinary businesses were selling for half price. The Knight Frank Wealth Report from 2009 documented a sharp rise in what it called liquidity preference among ultra-high net worth individuals beginning as early as 2006. These clients weren't hiding. They were positioning. This is precisely why the advice, stay invested, time in the market beats timing the market exists. Not because it's wrong. It works reasonably well for the average retail investor. But it's advice engineered for people who cannot move $500 million into T-bills without it becoming a visible market signal. For everyone else, operating from a standard brokerage account, there's no structural barrier to doing what Buffett does. There's only the cultural conditioning that tells you the move is too simple to be real. The mechanism operates on one iron principle. Crashes require sellers. Sellers require buyers. Buyers require cash. The ultra-wealthy accumulate the instrument that cannot be destroyed by the event they're anticipating. Then they wait, with the specific patience of someone who already knows the script. Asset 2. Now we get to the one that nobody in conventional finance wants you to understand. Because if you understood it, you would recognize that every major economic crisis is simultaneously a transfer mechanism. And the transfer only ever flows in one direction. The second asset is distressed debt. When a company approaches bankruptcy, its publicly traded bonds crater. A bond issued at 100 cents on the dollar might trade at 15 cents, 20 cents, sometimes less. The market, panicking and illiquid, prices these instruments for complete loss. Nobody wants them. Every retail investor has fled. The financial media is writing obituaries. This is precisely when the sophisticated money arrives. Howard Marks at Oaktree Capital built one of the largest alternative asset management firms in history almost entirely on this thesis. His October 2008 memo to clients, written as markets were in freefall, is now studied in graduate finance programs. His core argument, distressed debt is not a gamble on whether a company survives. It is a legal mechanism for taking ownership of a company's assets at a fraction of their replacement cost without paying equity price. Here's how the machinery works, and this is the part the financial press consistently fails to explain clearly. When a company enters bankruptcy, the waterfall of creditors determines priority of recovery. Senior secured debt holders sit at the top, junior bondholders below them. Equity holders, ordinary shareholders, occupy the bottom rung and typically receive nothing. The bankruptcy court restructures the company. Old equity is wiped out entirely. The bondholders who purchased distressed debt at 15 cents on the dollar receive new equity shares in the reorganized entity. They did not buy stock. They bought debt. They emerged as the new owners. During the 2008 to 2009 crisis, this mechanism played out at scale. Distressed debt funds purchased the obligations of automotive suppliers, commercial real estate trusts, and retail conglomerates that the market had written off as corpses. General Growth Properties, at the time the second largest mall operator in the United States, filed for bankruptcy in April 2009. Its debt traded for pennies. Brookfield Asset Management accumulated significant positions in that distressed paper. When GGP emerged from bankruptcy proceedings in November 2010, Brookfield held a controlling equity stake in a company managing over 200 shopping malls worth billions of dollars. The total cost of entry, distressed bonds, purchased at a fraction of face value. The Capgemini World Wealth Report from 2010 documented that high net worth individuals who maintained allocation to alternative credit strategies during the 2008 crisis outperformed standard diversified portfolios by 23% on average over the subsequent 3 years. Not because they were intellectually superior, because they had access to an instrument that retail investors are structurally excluded from by regulation, minimum investment thresholds, and deliberate opacity. The darker reality underneath this mechanism is what should concern anyone watching. Distressed debt requires a distressed economy to generate its raw material. Every corporate bankruptcy in a downturn represents, from one angle, human beings losing jobs, pensions, and accumulated savings. From the other angle, it represents the transfer of productive assets. Factories, logistics networks, real estate portfolios, from dispersed public shareholders to concentrated private capital at below market prices. The legal machinery of modern bankruptcy was not designed with this outcome as its explicit goal, but the outcomes are not neutral. And knowing the mechanism exists is the first step to understanding whose interests the financial architecture has been quietly optimized to serve. Asset 3. The third asset is the oldest one. Older than stock markets, older than bonds, older than central banking. It survived every collapse in this list and every collapse that preceded recorded history. And it is currently being accumulated at a pace that has no modern precedent. Productive agricultural land. The Knight Frank Wealth Report has tracked the farmland index for over a decade. Between 2000 and 2020, prime farmland in the United States appreciated by over 500%. It did not crater during the dot-com collapse. It did not buckle during the 2008 financial crisis. During the 2020 COVID shock, when REITs lost 40% and commercial real estate entered a multi-year reckoning, farmland gained 7%. The reason is not complicated. Land that produces food has a floor built into its value that no other asset class possesses. That floor is called caloric necessity. Human beings require calories to sustain biological function, regardless of whether a central bank has mispriced risk or a leveraged financial institution has become insolvent. In 2023, reporting by the Land Report and confirmed by USDA records revealed that Bill Gates had accumulated approximately 270,000 acres of American farmland across at least 18 states, making him the largest private farmland owner in the country. Mainstream media framed this as an eccentric billionaire hobby, or in more conspiratorial corners, something darker. The financial logic, however, is neither eccentric nor conspiratorial. It is ancient. In the Roman agricultural economy of the 1st century BC, the patrician class systematically accumulated public land during periods of debt crisis. As small farmers defaulted on obligations they could not service, the latifundia, massive estates owned by the senatorial class, expanded across the Italian peninsula. The same pattern appeared in post-Black Death Europe, where survivors with liquidity purchased abandoned farms from the estates of the dead at fractions of their former value. In post-WWI Germany, as the mark hyperinflated into worthlessness, foreign speculators and domestic industrialists holding hard currency purchased farmland from middle-class families who could no longer pay mortgages in real terms. Identical mechanism, different centuries. Land that feeds people retains its value when the paper used to measure that value disintegrates. The critical distinction that the forensic data from every crisis confirms is between agricultural land producing export crops and land serving only domestic consumption. During Venezuela's currency collapse post-2015, farmland connected to export agriculture, coffee, cacao, tropical fruits, with dollar-denominated international buyers, maintained real value. Urban commercial real estate denominated in bolivars became worthless. One asset was anchored to global demand. The other was anchored to a monetary system that ceased to exist. The asset isn't simply dirt. It is productive capacity anchored to demand that transcends the jurisdiction of any single failing currency. Asset 4. Walk into Sotheby's New York 4 to 6 months before a major market dislocation, not the public auction rooms, the private treaty sales department, accessible only by appointment, operating on relationship and referral. The private data from Sotheby's and Christie's reveals a pattern that has held for the better part of 50 years. Private treaty sales, direct transactions between collectors and institutional buyers, negotiated entirely outside public auction, spiked dramatically in the 18 to 24 months preceding major economic downturns. Before the 2008 crisis, private art sales through the major houses hit record volumes in 2006 and 2007. Before the dot-com crash in 2000, the same pattern emerged in 1998 and 1999. The thesis held again in late 2019 and early 2020. This is not a coincidence. It is asset class behavior reflecting a fundamental characteristic of blue-chip fine art that no financial instrument replicates: near-zero correlation to equity markets. A landmark study from May Moses, later acquired by Sotheby's itself, tracked fine art returns across 200 years of auction records. The finding was stark. Art returns show negative correlation to financial market crashes. When the S&P 500 fell 57% in 2008 to 2009, the top segment of the art market, defined as works by established artists with institutional provenance and deep collector demand, fell approximately 4%. 4%. Against 57. The mechanism behind this performance has nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with supply rigidity. A Gerhard Richter painting cannot be manufactured by a central bank. There is no art equivalent of quantitative easing. The supply of major works by historically established artists is finite in the most literal possible sense. The artist is dead and no longer producing. In an environment where fiat currency supply can expand by $3 trillion in a single month, as it did during the Federal Reserve's March 2020 emergency intervention, any asset with a permanently fixed supply becomes a vehicle for wealth preservation by structural necessity. Money chases scarcity when scarcity cannot be printed away. The private treaty mechanism adds a second layer that rarely receives public analysis. Public auctions are price transparent and subject to market sentiment. Private treaties are not. During periods of financial stress, buyers and sellers negotiate directly. The seller, often requiring liquidity to cover losses elsewhere, accepts a below-market price. The buyer acquires the work at a discount that will not appear in any public index, will not be tracked by conventional financial reporting, and moves through accounting structures of considerable complexity. The transaction's opacity is not incidental to the strategy. For the ultra-high net worth community, the opacity is a central feature. The Capgemini World Wealth Report has noted consistently since 2010 that investments of passion, encompassing fine art, rare wine, classic automobiles, and colored gemstones, represent between 5% and 10% of UHNWI portfolio allocations globally, with that figure rising measurably in the 12 months preceding documented financial stress events. This is not passion. This is pattern recognition with a multi-generational time horizon wearing passion as its disguise. Asset 5. The last one is the one that makes everything else on this list look like a defensive maneuver, because the first 4 assets are forms of protection, stores of value, mechanisms for capital preservation during dislocations. They protect wealth, they transfer wealth at the margins. The 5th asset is not defense. It is offense. It is the mechanism through which entirely new fortunes are constructed during economic collapses, not merely preserved. And it is hiding in the least glamorous corner of private equity deal flow. Essential service monopoly businesses. After every major economic crisis in the 20th and 21st centuries, the forensic record of private equity acquisition data shows a behavioral pattern so consistent it borders on algorithmic. In the 12 to 36 months following a major market dislocation, sophisticated capital systematically targets businesses operating in sectors with inelastic demand: waste management, self-storage, funeral services, pest control, water infrastructure, and medical waste processing. These businesses share a single property that sounds unremarkable until you say it plainly. People cannot stop using their services regardless of economic conditions. A family that has lost its income still generates garbage. It still requires a storage unit when it downsizes from a house it can no longer afford. It still needs pest control when the infestation doesn't consult unemployment statistics before arriving. Death, particularly during crisis, operates entirely independent of central bank policy. The economic profile of these businesses under distress is almost perverse in its advantage to the acquirer. During a downturn, their revenues remain stable. Their labor costs fall as unemployment eliminates workers' negotiating leverage. Their competitors, often smaller operators using leverage to finance expansion, default on debt and go under. The acquiring entity purchases routes, contracts, client lists, and equipment at liquidation prices from operators who can no longer service their obligations. Wayne Huizenga understood this before almost anyone in modern private equity. He built waste management into a national giant, not during an economic boom, but by acquiring small regional operators during the stagflationary recession of the mid-1970s. No innovation required, no disruption thesis, no technology edge. Garbage trucks drive the same route whether the economy is growing at 4% or contracting at 4%. He acquired the assets when sellers were distressed, held the monopoly when the economy recovered, and repeated the cycle in subsequent contractions. PitchBook data on private market transactions documents the pattern repeating in every cycle. Between 2009 and 2012, acquisition of essential service businesses by institutional private equity accelerated by over 40% compared to pre-crisis levels. Funeral homes, storage rates, water treatment operators, and medical waste handlers were acquired at depressed valuation multiples while their underlying cash flows, the actual economic substance of the business, remained entirely intact. This brings us to the final piece of forbidden knowledge embedded in this entire pattern, and it is the most uncomfortable one. The businesses that retail investors and financial media ignore during boom times, boring, unglamorous, generating no cultural excitement, carrying no narrative of disruption, become the highest return acquisition targets during bust times for precisely that reason. They were ignored. Nobody inflated their valuations with speculative premium. Nobody assigned them a multiple that required 30 years of perfect execution to justify. They were undervalued in the good times. They became dirt cheap in the bad times. And their cash flows never stopped. Glamour during expansion. Essential monopoly during contraction. The cycle is consistent enough to plan around it. Here's what you actually absorbed in this video, and it's larger than the 5 assets. Every economic crash in modern history has not been a random natural disaster. It has been a predictable, cyclical redistribution event. Capital flows from the unprepared to the prepared, from the panicked to the patient, from the passive holder to the structurally positioned acquirer. The middle class was taught that crashes are things that happen to them. The data from SEC filings, Knight Frank, Capgemini, and a century of private auction and acquisition records tells a different story. Crashes are scheduled shopping events for people who know what they're buying, why they're buying it, and what price they're willing to pay. The financial system never hid this through malice. It obscured it through the assumption that this information is only actionable for people already holding access to these vehicles. That assumption is false. The principles are not vehicle-specific. Cash is ammunition. Essential businesses are permanent cash flow. Agricultural land is a caloric claim on the future. Distressed debt is an ownership mechanism in disguise. Art is non-correlated preservation wrapped in cultural legitimacy. None of this requires a prime brokerage account to understand. What it requires is the willingness to look at what people building generational wealth are actually doing, not what they're saying at Davos, not what they're publishing in op-eds, and sit with one uncomfortable question. If the next crash has already begun casting its shadow forward into the present, measured in the T-bill accumulations, the private art deals, the quiet farmland acquisitions, the distressed debt positions being built by people whose entire professional lives are organized around this single recurring event. Where do you want to be standing when it arrives? Subscribe if you want to keep asking better questions.